Hey there, this is Alexis Knight. Welcome to True Crime, the Court of Public Opinion. I am your host, guiding you through cases that have moved through the courts and reached a conclusion, but left the public divided. These are not your typical cut and dried cases. These are the ones where the facts may be clear. The truth? Well, that's another story. Now imagine this. You're living in what should be a peaceful home, surrounded by family. But the relationships behind closed doors are strained, even toxic. Tensions rise day by day until one morning, they finally erupt into something deadly. A woman, a grandmother, decides she's had enough and picks up a gun. By the end of it, her son-in-law lies dead. She claims it was to protect her family from years of abuse. But was it really self-defense or something far more sinister? That's exactly what happened in Fallbrook, California on February 11th in 2014. The case of Cynthia Cdebaca shocked her community, sparked debate about the boundaries of self-defense, and led to a trial that left no one fully satisfied. Was she protecting her family, or was this a calculated, cold-blooded act of murder? Stick with me as we unravel the layers of this case, examine the evidence, and take a closer look at the jury's decision and why the public remains divided to this very day. Fallbrook, California, a quiet community nestled in San Diego County, became the setting for a shocking crime on February 11th, 2014. Cynthia, a 63-year-old grandmother, awoke that morning feeling angry and resentful. Her son-in-law, Geoward Eustaquio, had reportedly made life difficult for her and her family. And as the morning unfolded, Cynthia left the house, but not for a casual walk or an errand. Instead, she drives to a local gun store, purchases a revolver, goes back home, and she's got one grim purpose in her mind, and that's it. And then what happens next was chilling. Cynthia confronted Geoward in the family home, and after a heated exchange, she fires multiple shots at him, and by the time it's over, Geoward was dead, his body riddled with 12 gunshot wounds. Cynthia admitted to the killing almost immediately, even confessing her actions with shocking nonchalance during her police interview. Surveillance footage later revealed her celebrating at a nearby casino after this incident, indulging in a meal and gambling just hours after Geoward's death. During the trial, Cynthia's defense argued that her actions stemmed from years of witnessing abuse directed at her daughter and her grandchildren, and they painted a picture of a desperate woman who believed she had no other choice. The prosecution presented a very different narrative. This was no act of self-defense, they say. Instead, they argued it was premeditated murder fueled by years of resentment. The jury ultimately sided with the prosecution here, convicting Cynthia of first-degree murder and sentencing her to 50 years to life in prison. But the verdict didn't end the public debate. Was Cynthia a protective grandmother pushed to the brink, or was this a calculated and vengeful act? Today, we will explore every detail of this case, from the allegations of abuse to the chilling aftermath. And then you will have the chance to decide for yourself where justice truly lies. Okay, so on February 11th in 2014, we have Cynthia, a 63-year-old grandmother, who made a decision that would leave her family shattered and her community reeling. Living with her daughter Laura, her son-in-law Geoward, and their children in Fallbrook, California, Cynthia had endured what she described as torment for years. This went on year after year, Cynthia claimed. Geoward's behavior created a toxic atmosphere in the home. She painted a picture of a man who was verbally abusive and controlling, a disciplinarian who kept her and her daughter and grandchildren under a constant cloud of fear. Geoward's criticisms were relentless. Cynthia alleged, and she believed, his harsh words and domineering ways were tearing her family apart. Family members would later testify that Cynthia often spoke of her concerns about Geoward's treatment of her loved ones. And on that fateful morning, she claimed she had finally reached her breaking point. But here's where the story takes a turn that makes you question everything. Cynthia left the house. She drove to a nearby gun store, purchased a revolver, and returned with it in hand. If she was acting out of fear for her family, why didn't she leave or call for help? Why did she arm herself and return to confront Geoward? The prosecution argued this was not about self-defense. It was about years of resentment boiling over, and they claimed that Cynthia's decisions to shoot Geoward 12 times in their home was a calculated and premeditated act of revenge, not a desperate act to protect her family. Adding to the controversy, Cynthia's behavior after the shooting seemed cold and detached because she left the scene, went to a casino, and was caught on surveillance gambling and eating as though nothing had happened. So to many, this was the behavior of someone who felt no remorse for her actions. And yet, Cynthia never wavered in her claim. She believed she had no choice. To her, Geoward's death meant her family's survival. And to others, her actions went far beyond what could ever be justified. So what do you think? So far into this, was Cynthia a grandmother who acted out of desperation to save her family? Or was she a woman who crossed the line into cold-blooded murder? As we dive deeper, you're going to see just how blurred these lines can become in cases like this. Cynthia claimed that living under the same roof as Geoward was like living with a ticking time bomb. She described him as a man who demanded control over every aspect of the household, and he ruled with an iron fist. Nothing escaped criticism. Her cooking, her appearance, even the way she interacted with his children. Cynthia alleged that his behavior wasn't just harsh, it was demeaning, and it was relentless. He would berate her daughter Laura in front of the children, calling her worthless and a bad mother. And his temper was explosive, Cynthia said, and his words cut deeply. Even the children weren't spared. According to Cynthia, Geoward believed in strict discipline, often shouting at the kids for minor infractions, leaving them in tears. She spoke of watching her grandchildren walk on eggshells around their own father, too afraid to make a mistake. Cynthia also claimed that Geoward controlled Laura financially. He would give her only small allowances and then question every single penny that she spent. Laura's self-esteem plummeted under the constant scrutiny, and she became a shadow of the confident woman she once was. This is what Cynthia was saying. And for her, watching her daughter and her grandchildren suffer day after day was unbearable. And she said she had tried to intervene before, only to face Geoward's wrath herself. She recounted one particularly chilling incident where he allegedly warned her, "Stay out of my business or you're going to regret it." By the time that fateful February morning arrived, Cynthia believed the situation had reached its breaking point. The argument that day started, she said, when Geoward made another disparaging comment. This time it was about how she was dressed, and she claimed it wasn't just about her clothes. It was another attempt to humiliate her, to assert his dominance in the household. Cynthia said she snapped. In her mind, she wasn't just defending herself. She was defending her daughter, her grandchildren, and the life they deserved to live. So to Cynthia, this wasn't just a man, this was a tyrant, and in her eyes, his death was the only way to free her family from the oppression they had endured for so long. But does that justify what happened next? As we continue, we will explore whether her actions were those of a protector or something darker. While Cynthia's defense painted her as a grandmother protecting her family, the prosecution had an entirely different story to tell. They argued that Cynthia's actions were not about desperation or survival. They were about revenge. To start, they pointed out the premeditated nature of her actions. Cynthia didn't react in the heat of the moment. She left the house. She drove to a gun store and purchased a revolver, and then returned home. The entire process took time. Time, the prosecution argued, for her to think and reconsider. Time for her to stop herself. But she didn't, and instead she came back, loaded the weapon, and confronted Geoward with deadly intent. The evidence at the scene painted a chilling picture. Cynthia shot Geoward 12 times. The prosecution argued that the sheer number of shots showed not self-defense, but overkill. Autopsy reports revealed that some of the wounds were inflicted while Geoward was already down, suggesting she just kept firing after he was no longer a threat. But it wasn't just the act itself that raised questions. It was what happened afterward. Surveillance footage showed Cynthia at a nearby casino just hours later, calmly gambling and eating. And to the prosecution, this behavior was the final nail in the coffin. How could someone who had just acted in self-defense be so relaxed and detached, so celebratory? Just didn't add up, they argued. Then there was her confession. During her police interview, Cynthia showed little remorse, even joking about what she had done. "I guess I'm not going to make it to bingo tonight," she reportedly told the officers. For the prosecution, this was not the behavior of a terrified grandmother. This was the behavior of someone who felt very justified, even triumphant. They also questioned her narrative of abuse. While some family members corroborated her claims, others described Geoward as strict, but not abusive. Was Cynthia exaggerating his behavior to justify her actions? Or was she blinded by resentment, holding on to years of grievances that finally boiled over that morning? As the jury listened to both sides, the weight of the decision became clear. Was this self-defense, or was this premeditated murder? As we move deeper into this trial, we're going to uncover the key arguments that shaped the case and the verdict that left the public divided. Okay, so let's get into the facts of this case, what actually went on. February 11th, 2014, it began like any other day in Fallbrook, California. The Eustaquio household stirred with the usual morning routines, but beneath the surface, tensions were brewing. For Cynthia, the morning's events were the culmination of years of frustration and resentment. By 8 a.m., she'd already argued with Geoward over her choice of clothing, a confrontation she claimed was one humiliation too many. After the argument, Cynthia left the house. According to surveillance footage, she drove to a nearby gun store and purchased a .38 caliber revolver. The transaction was quick and uneventful, but it marked the beginning of a series of irreversible choices. Cynthia then returned home, revolver in hand, and confronted Geoward in the kitchen. Now, the exact details of what transpired next remain a point of contention. Cynthia claimed that Geoward threatened her during the argument and she feared for her life. In her words, she acted out of instinct, firing the revolver to protect herself and her family. But the physical evidence told a more chilling story. Investigators found Geoward's body slumped in the kitchen. He had been shot 12 times, with several wounds indicating he was struck while already on the ground. Bullet casings were scattered across the floor, suggesting Cynthia moved around as she fired. There were no signs of a physical struggle, no overturned furniture, no injuries to Cynthia herself. Only the aftermath of a deadly confrontation. Within hours of the shooting, Cynthia was at a local casino, as calm and composed as if nothing had happened. Surveillance footage showed her sitting at a slot machine, eating a meal and placing bets. When police arrived to arrest her, she didn't even resist. In fact, she seemed oddly cooperative, even cheerful. During her interview, she openly admitted to the killing, saying, "I'm glad he's gone." As the trial approached, both sides prepared to present their case. The defense aimed to depict Cynthia as a desperate woman pushed to the brink by years of abuse, while the prosecution framed her as a calculated killer. But what would the jury believe, and how would the public react to the revelations that came out in court? When Cynthia's trial began, the courtroom was packed. Family members, neighbors, and community members had all come to hear how a grandmother ended up killing her son-in-law. For many, the case was deeply personal, falling along a fine line between self-defense and premeditated murder. The prosecution laid out their evidence with precision, starting with Cynthia's purchase of the revolver. Surveillance footage from the gun store showed Cynthia calmly selecting and buying the weapon just hours before the shooting. And to them, this was undeniable proof of premeditation. She had time to think and reconsider, yet she chose to go through with it. And then there was the autopsy report. Geoward had been shot 12 times, with several bullets entering from angles that suggested he was already on the ground. The prosecution argued that this was not self-defense, this was an act of rage. They pointed out the lack of evidence to support Cynthia's claim that Geoward had threatened her during this confrontation. There were no bruises, no defensive wounds. There was nothing to suggest she had been in any immediate danger. The defense, as always, they present a very different narrative. They brought in witnesses who spoke about Geoward's behavior. Family friends testified that they had seen Geoward belittle Laura and the children in public. One neighbor recounted hearing arguments through the walls, describing Geoward as a man with a volatile temper. The defense's star witness was Laura herself, who tearfully recounted years of emotional abuse at the hands of her husband. Laura's testimony was harrowing. She described feeling trapped, unable to leave because Geoward's control over every aspect of her life, from the family finances to her relationships with friends. She spoke of Cynthia as her only source of support, the one person who understood what she was going through. The defense also argued that Cynthia's behavior at the casino was not an act of celebration. It was a coping mechanism. She was in shock, they claimed, trying to process what had happened in the only way she knew how. The trial became a battle of narratives. Was Cynthia a protector who acted out of desperation? Or was this woman a killer who let years of resentment drive her to violence? As testimony concluded, the jury faced the daunting task of deciding her fate. As the trial unfolded, the tension in the courtroom was palpable. Each new piece of evidence seemed to tilt the scales, making it harder to pin down the actual truth. The prosecution emphasized Cynthia's lack of immediate remorse. Her police interview became a focal point, played for the jury in its entirety. In it, Cynthia appeared calm, even flippant, as she recounted the events. She admitted to firing the gun repeatedly, but showed no visible signs of any guilt or sorrow. "He deserved it," she said at one point. To the prosecution, this was not a woman acting in self-defense. This was someone acting out of anger. But the defense countered by painting Cynthia as a woman who had reached her breaking point, and they called expert witnesses to discuss the psychological impact of prolonged exposure to abuse, both as a victim and as a bystander. One psychologist testified that Cynthia likely experienced a state of hyperarousal. This is a condition where the brain reacts to perceived threats with heightened aggression. To them, her actions were tragic, but they were understandable. They were the result of years of living in a high-stress environment. The jury also heard from the grandchildren, whose testimonies were both heartbreaking and contradictory. One child described Geoward as strict but loving, while another said they often felt scared when their father was angry. This conflicting narrative muddied the waters. Could Cynthia's perception of Geoward's behavior have been exaggerated by her own resentment? Or was she the only one willing to acknowledge what was really going on? Meanwhile, the community outside the courtroom was just as divided. Some viewed Cynthia as a hero, a grandmother who stood up against years of abuse to protect her family. And others saw her as a cold-blooded killer who had taken the law into her own hands. And the media added fuel to the fire with headlines that alternated between depicting her as a vigilante and a vengeful murderer. As the trial neared its end, the prosecution and defense made their final arguments. The prosecution leaned heavily on the forensic evidence, arguing that the sheer number of gunshots in the absence of any physical threat made it clear that this was no act of self-defense. The defense, on the other hand, pleaded with the jury to please consider those years of suffering that Cynthia had endured and the lengths she believed she needed to go in order to protect her family. When the jury finally delivered their verdict, it left as many questions as answers. But was it justice? That's the question we're going to explore next. When it came to the prosecution's case, their argument was clear and methodical. This was not a desperate act of self-defense. It was a calculated and vengeful killing. They began by focusing on Cynthia's timeline, emphasizing the deliberate nature of her actions. The purchase of the revolver was a critical point. This woman left the house, drove to the gun store, legally purchased the gun. The prosecution argued that this gave Cynthia ample time to rethink her decision, yet she chose to return armed and to confront Geoward. The forensic evidence became their next cornerstone because of that autopsy revealing the 12 gunshot wounds, several of which were described as non-lethal but incapacitating, meaning Geoward was likely alive for at least part of this shooting. Ballistic experts testified that some of the shots were fired from above, suggesting Geoward was already on the ground. And the prosecution called this overkill, a sign that Cynthia's actions were driven by rage, not self-defense. And they also highlighted Cynthia's behavior after the incident when she went gambling. She looked satisfied. And the prosecution asked the question, if Cynthia was acting to save her family, where was her remorse? Where was the fear or the shock that typically accompanies such an act? But the defense's counter-argument struck at the heart of the case, urging the jury to consider Cynthia's perspective. They painted her as a woman trapped in a nightmare, watching her daughter and grandchildren endure what she believed were years of both emotional and psychological abuse. Her attorney told the jury, this was not premeditation, this was desperation. And they argued that the gun purchase wasn't a calculated move, it was the act of a woman who felt like she had no other options. Cynthia's attorney also focused on the power dynamics in the household. Geoward's alleged control over Laura and the children was described as a silent tyranny, one that eroded their emotional well-being over time. And to the defense, Cynthia's decision to act was not born out of hate, it was born out of love. But was that enough to justify what happened? That's the question the jury and the public struggled to answer. The defense's portrayal of Cynthia as a protective grandmother relied heavily on the testimonies of those closest to the family. They argued that Geoward's behavior created a toxic environment, so oppressive that Cynthia believed her actions were not only justified, but necessary. Laura's testimony became the emotional core of their case. She spoke in vivid detail about the years she spent under Geoward's control, describing how he isolated her from friends, micromanaged the family finances, and frequently belittled her in front of their children. Her words painted a picture of a household that was ruled by fear. She said, he made me feel like I was nothing, recounting moments when Geoward's anger left her and the children trembling. The defense argued that Cynthia saw all of this unfold daily, and she felt powerless to intervene until that February morning. To Cynthia, her attorney claimed picking up the revolver was the only way to protect her daughter and grandchildren from further harm. The prosecution was not about to let that narrative go unchallenged. They pointed out inconsistencies in the defense's portrayal of Geoward. While some witnesses corroborated Laura's claims, others described him as strict but not abusive. A former colleague testified that Geoward was a loving father who took pride in his family, casting doubt on the defense's characterization of him as a tyrant. The prosecution also questioned Cynthia's motives. If she was truly acting to save her family, why didn't she call the police? Why not seek legal avenues to remove Geoward from the home? They argued that Cynthia's decision to purchase a gun and return to confront Geoward showed clear intent, not impulsive actions, someone desperate, the calculated steps of someone who had already made up their mind. They also emphasized Cynthia's apparent lack of fear during the shooting. There were no signs of any struggle, no evidence that she felt physically threatened in that moment. Instead, the prosecution described her as calm and composed, methodically firing shot after shot. And to them, this was not the behavior of someone defending their family. This was the behavior of someone who had decided long before that morning that Geoward needed to die. As both sides rested their cases, the jury was left with a tangled web of narratives. Was Cynthia a hero? Or had she become the very thing she claimed to be protecting her family from? The decision was anything but simple. The trial may have ended with a verdict, but for the public, the debate over Cynthia's case was far from resolved. Her story stirred emotions and raised questions that went beyond the courtroom, dividing opinion along stark lines. Supporters of Cynthia pointed to the years of alleged abuse she and her family endured at Geoward's hands, and for them, this was a case about a broken system. How many times, they asked, had victims been left to fend for themselves while their abusers escaped accountability? To Cynthia's advocates, she represented the countless women who feel powerless to protect their families until it is too late. Her actions, though extreme, were seen as a last resort. She saved her family. One supporter wrote on social media, "If the system won't protect you, what choice do you have?" they said. But on the other hand, there were the critics as well, who saw Cynthia's actions in a completely different light. That premeditation, driving, getting the revolver, all of that, to them, created a person who was not a savior, but a vigilante who took justice into her own hands. And critics argued that her behavior would set a dangerous precedent, one where personal grievances could be used to justify lethal forces. This wasn't self-defense, one person argued. This was a clear case of revenge. The media's portrayal of the case only added fuel to this fire. Depending on which headline you read, Cynthia was either a heroic grandmother who stood up to an abuser, or she was a vengeful killer who executed her son-in-law. There were talk shows and news outlets and social media platforms that all weighed in, each framing her actions through their own lens. The polarized coverage shaped public opinion, turning Cynthia's case into a broader conversation about the nature of self-defense and the boundaries of justice. One of the most challenging aspects of this case was the emotional complexity it presented. If Geoward truly was the abusive figure that Cynthia described, could her actions be justified, even if they were premeditated? Conversely, if the abuse was exaggerated or misinterpreted, does that make her guilty of cold-blooded murder? And where does the legal definition of self-defense fit into this moral gray area? These questions highlight a fundamental tension in cases like Cynthia's. Can someone be both a victim and a perpetrator? How do we weigh the psychological toll of years of alleged abuse against the cold reality of a man shot 12 times? And perhaps most importantly, how do we as a society decide where the line is between justice and vengeance? Cynthia's case is a reminder of how deeply personal these debates can become. Whether you see her as a protector or a killer, likely depends on your own experiences, values, and beliefs. It's no wonder that this case continues to spark conversation years after the courtroom lights have dimmed. And all right, so now you've heard the story, the evidence, and the arguments. Where do you stand? Cynthia's case isn't just about what happened that day. It's about the ripple effects of her choices and the complexity of human behavior. It's about how years of pain and anger can culminate in a single life-altering moment. People can get pushed to the brink. If you believe Cynthia, her actions were the only option left for her. She was a grandmother who watched her family suffer, powerless to intervene, until she finally snapped. In her mind, the gun was a shield, a way to protect her daughter and grandchildren from a man she believed was destroying them, piece by piece. But then, on the other hand, the prosecution's perspective can't be ignored. Cynthia did not act in the heat of the moment. She left the house, bought a gun, returned with a deadly plan. Her actions were calculated, methodical, and they were final. And her behavior after the shooting, the calm casino visit, the lack of remorse, paints a picture that's hard to reconcile with that idea of self-defense. So what do you think? Was this a grandmother pushed to the brink, or a woman consumed by years of resentment? Was Cynthia protecting her family or taking the law into her own hands? Did the jury get it right with a conviction for first-degree murder? Or does her case fall into a moral gray area where justice becomes nearly impossible to define? It's not an easy question to answer, and maybe that's the point. Cases like this challenge us to examine our own beliefs about right and wrong, about what we consider justifiable, and about how we judge the actions of others when we don't know the full story. They remind us that the line between victim and perpetrator is often thinner than we'd like to admit. I'll leave you to decide, but one thing is clear. Cynthia's case will remain a topic of debate for years to come, a reminder of how justice can feel both absolute and elusive at the same time. Thank you for joining me in True Crime, the Court of Public Opinion. Stay safe out there, ask the difficult questions, and always dig for the truth. Until next time, this is Alexis Knight.